turning it off.
Thank you all for coming this evening. Our matriculating students had an interesting conversation for an hour before we started the full session here. And needless to say, immediately after that, they all ran to the grocery store next door to get some food. So we are focused on foodways, nutrition, resilience, sustainability, and the impact of climate change on what and how we eat. I guess that's the easiest way to describe it. I'll turn this over to Rebecca.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. It is so nice to see so many returning faces and lots of new faces tonight. I wanted to share also with our global audience, we have hundreds of people watching the live stream and the videos after the fact. And so our goal of building a learning community that hopefully will now take what we're learning and then take action, I have hope that that will actually be the case. And so in the spirit of building our learning community, let's do our weekly practice of finding folks near us who we don't know and introducing ourselves to make those new connections. Thank you so much for doing that. I wish we had so much more time for that part of the night. I also want to draw attention for all of the students in the audience. Our Office of Undergraduate Research and Fellowships is sponsoring lunches on Thursday for students who are coming to the course or studying climate change and other courses on campus to get together and process what we're learning. We know it's a lot to carry, both intellectually and emotionally, and the idea of building community together among our student body is really important to us. I also want to mention that tonight a number of students are going to be staying here after class and starting to build a coalition across the various student groups on campus who are working on climate issues, sustainability, resilience, environmental justice. And so if you would like to stay for that and you're a member of our student population, please do. I also want to draw attention to this opportunity for students, whether you are here tonight or watching the live stream or the video. We are very proud in the Social Impact Lab to partner with the Millennium Campus Network on a program called the Millennium Fellowship. This is the only UN-endorsed undergraduate leadership development program, and it's focused on the Sustainable Development Goals. And we have been a Millennium campus for the last couple of years because we have reached a critical mass of students at Northeastern who have qualified to participate and become Millennium Fellows. And so I encourage you, if you're interested, you can contact me in the Social Impact Lab and check out the website here at millenniumfellows.org. This is a student-led learning opportunity where you will each be working on your own project related to one of the Sustainable Development Goals, many of which, of course, are tied to the topics that we're covering in the course this semester. I also just want to provide this information again to help us continue to spread the word about the course. Our social media handles and hashtags are up there. We have a really easy way for you to get back to the landing page for the course. It's a bit.ly address. So, and you have to write it exactly like that. So http://bit.ly/NU climate course. And I want to remind you that it's not just the schedule of all of the classes that we have coming up, but also we have the video archive there and an amazing and growing list of resources. And I have to give a shout out to the librarians. Christine Oka and Rawson Palmatier from the library have just collected for us every week amazing resources, and they came to us and asked if they could do that for us. So just a big shout out and appreciation to our librarians. And also our speakers are helping us with that list. So it's a great list of resources. And then if you'd like to invite friends on Facebook, we have another bit.ly address, and it's just called Climate Change Course FB. The teacher in me also wants to just take a moment to orient you to where we are in the semester and what's to come so that you can plan ahead. This is the last class in the first part of the course that we're thinking of as our world in flux, in which we've been looking at manifestations in climate change at the intersection of ecological and human systems. We're going to switch gears starting with our next class and dive deeper into human impacts, looking in particular at the way climate change is disproportionately affecting vulnerable communities and how it is making all communities more vulnerable. So we're going to start by looking at, I'm sorry, we're missing a word, and it's not just environmental on the 5th, it's environmental justice. Then we're going to be having an amazing kind of outside-the-box interactive experience on February 12th with Pablo Suarez from the Red Cross Climate Center. We're going to be looking at understanding and coping with climate change. So from a cognition perspective, why is it hard for folks to wrap their heads around it? And then from an emotional perspective, what does it mean to be processing a future that will be defined in many ways by climate change? We'll be looking at global development, how this is affecting people in the global south and the relationship between poverty and climate change, migration and refugees, and colonialism and indigenous people rounds out that middle section on human impacts. And then in the last part of the course, we're going to be looking at levers of change and ways that we can be turning what we're learning here into action. And with that, I'm so pleased to introduce Liz Allan. She's a postdoctoral research associate here at Northeastern, associated with some of our colleagues who you met last week from our Global Resilience Institute. And I'm just going to hand the mic right over to you. And thank you so much for being here.
Great. Thank you all for coming tonight. Okay, great. So as Rebecca noted, I'm a postdoctoral research associate at the Global Resilience Institute here at Northeastern University. And my previous research has addressed questions about how climate change impacts are being felt in the agricultural sector, especially working in the Northwest US. And I've also been really interested in the role that impacts models developed in academia are being used in land use and agricultural management decision making. So I want to begin my talk this evening by just sharing a perspective on what it means to adapt a resilience perspective to understand global food and agricultural systems in the context of climate change. So as I'm sure many of you are kind of familiar, resilience thinking has become a really increasingly pervasive as part of strategic programming within development and humanitarian organizations around the world. And there's a real push and pull dialogue that's unfolding about how to define, operationalize, and evaluate what is resilient and the resilience of different approaches or systems. And so the discourse of resilience can be sometimes invoked to kind of shore up the status quo, but it can also be a framework for social and environmental justice. And the concept of resilience has been developed as it's been developed in socio-ecological systems thinking and allied disciplines, can really inform how we interpret vulnerabilities of the current global food system, as well as opportunities for where there's like opportunities for transformational change. So as I sort of frame it, resilience is an emergent property of complex systems, and the concept encompasses not just the ability to withstand disruption and to maintain function when conditions change, but beyond that, a resilient system has the capacity to adapt and evolve as boundary conditions shift. And the concept is really compatible with the ideas developed in food sovereignty movements that assert that people around the world have the right to define their own food and agricultural systems in culturally and ecologically appropriate ways. And this framing emphasizes equitable decision-making about food systems, including resources for food production, such as land and water. So this evening, I'll be addressing the question of how is climate change impacting food systems around the world from a big picture perspective. I'll talk about some of the ways in which climate change or climate system breakdown, as it's increasingly understood, is being felt in agricultural systems, and some of the complex feedback loops connecting Earth's climate systems with agricultural production practices. I'll provide a kind of quick window into scientific research that's informing our understanding of how climate change is impacting agriculture. And we'll look at some of the factors that have led to wicked problems embedded in the food system around the globe. And finally, I'll outline some of the ways that initiatives and approaches aligned with the goals of food sovereignty and food justice might contribute to a more sustainable, equitable global food system. And that'll feed into the talks that my colleagues will be giving afterwards, kind of digging into those issues on a national and a local scale. Okay, so the first key point here is that we're living in a time of rapid global climate change. Greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere are accumulating, causing more of this Earth's incoming solar radiation to be trapped as heat. And over geological time, there have been fluctuations in the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But the rapid increase in carbon dioxide is attributable to burning of fossil fuels and land use change connected with our agricultural systems and global population growth and resource intensification. So this level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is unprecedented in Earth's history. We're currently hovering a little above 400 parts per million in the atmosphere. And even if we drastically reduce emissions, we'll be dealing with the climatic consequences of this shift for a long time because of the long residence time of these compounds in the atmosphere. All right, so these data from NOAA illustrate the annual average temperature deviation in 2018 from the 100-year historical record. So you can get a sense that throughout most of the globe, the average temperature was 1 to 2 degrees Celsius higher than the historical average in 2018. And also, and global circulation currents are such that the impacts of this warming is not felt evenly across the globe. We see shifts in the duration and the intensity of heat events and the frequency and intensity of storms and changing precipitations around the world linked to this. So here's my brother in Oregon moving some center pivot irrigation sprinklers. This is the Willamette Valley, and in this region, it's historically been a really productive zone for fruit and vegetable production. But in the last decade, there have been frequent moderate to severe drought conditions in summer months. Some of this is tied to less rainfall overall, but it's also attributable to warming in the winter months that causes more of that rainfall to be deposited, or more of that precipitation to be deposited as rain, running off into rivers at a time when the soils are saturated and there's not the crop demand for those water resources. And so this warming leads to less snowpack in the summer months at the times when crops are water stressed and river levels are at critical lows. So these summer droughts can lead to significant crop and pasture losses and restrictions on water withdrawals. And droughts in the U.S. Can be economically costly and highly disruptive to rural communities, but severe droughts in much of the rest of the world, where people's sustenance depends on the success of local food production, can be absolutely devastating, causing widespread hunger and malnutrition. All right, so climate change also, and I'm sorry, I'll back to this for just a minute, because I wanted to note that climate change also increases the risk of crop failure and heat stress due to other extreme weather events like freeze or increased intensity of precipitation that can cause erosion. Also linked to global climate change is shifts in the range and distribution of pests and disease species. So for example, warmer winter months may mean that an aphid species that's a pest for crops, if there's not a sustained period of days with a critical freeze temperature, those aphids could be increasingly severe, causing major crop losses or increased use of pesticides to combat them. So this is kind of a simplified illustration of the complex network of interactions between the global climate system and agricultural production practices around the world. Agriculture contributes to greenhouse gas emissions in the form of fertilizers that are produced using oil and natural gas, and also those fertilizers, when they're then applied to crops, emit nitrous oxides, which are a greenhouse gas similar to carbon dioxide. There's also emissions from the actual work and labor of food production, processing, and transportation around the world. Refrigeration is a surprisingly large component of those, source of those emissions. And clearing of forest land for crops and grazing and monocultures also contribute to the climate change emissions impact of agriculture, as does methane emitted by ruminant animals, as well as food waste. So climate disruption, in turn, can contribute to the loss of topsoil due to extreme storm events. It can speed up the rates of groundwater withdrawal, groundwater depletion when there's not sufficient fresh water available for agricultural production, and it can also reduce the productivity of plant and animal agriculture because of heat stress. All of these impacts then, in turn, can potentially accelerate the rate at which agricultural producers turn to practices that, in turn, contribute to further climate change. So it's kind of a vicious cycle in this sense. So I want to talk just very briefly about how do we know that agriculture is being impacted by climate change? How do we know that the climate is changing? Researchers collect long-term data about weather. You see up here on the slide an image of a weather data station, and there's a national and global network of these observation stations that collect information about daily temperatures, accumulated precipitation, rates of evaporation. Some of the sites are also monitoring wind and the exchange of atmospheric gases between the land surface and the air. Remote sensing using satellite imagery is also a really powerful tool for collecting data on atmospheric temperature, land surface coverage, and these kinds of variables. And it's really important that we have these long-term data sets, observations. So, at this station, it recorded 140 years of monitoring at this site. We know that the site reached a low of negative 42 degrees Fahrenheit, a high of 109, and these kind of observations are critical to have an idea of what a given region is capable of and a baseline approximations. And so when we're looking towards the future and what climate change may look like in the future, global climate models simulate oceanic, atmospheric, and land surface behavior with big grid cells. So for example, one grid cell in a global climate model may cover the state of Massachusetts. And there are multiple different global climate models that all make different assumptions about the physical processes happening between the atmosphere and the Earth's surface. And as well as variation among these models, they consistently and uniformly anticipate that global climate warming and disruption to the climate system is occurring. And then researchers, based on these global climate models, can generate higher resolution or downscaled projections of local impacts by using station data to consider the effects of local topography. So example would be a mountain range that has a rain shadow effect, and those kind of impacts can be modeled in a downscaled projection and then linked with hydrological and vegetation process-based models to get very specific projections about climate change for a given commodity in a given region. So in the Northwest US, where my doctoral research was based, we're already seeing some market effects of climate change on the growing ranges of different crops and the suitability of particular regions for given production systems. So for example, the region that's historically supported non-irrigated, or they call it dry land wheat production, is shifting northward and eastward in the region. Okay, and I want to talk now about agricultural production systems around the world. Roughly 40% of the world's population is currently engaged in agriculture as their primary livelihood. And in the developing world, this number would be closer to 65% of the population, many of whom are small-scale subsistence farmers. The landscape of how agriculture is practiced in the US and the developed world has really shifted radically in the last 100 years. So currently, I just looked up the statistics today, there's about 1% of the US population is actually engaged in on-farm labor, then maybe another 10% engaged in sort of associated processing, transportation of agricultural commodities. So the majority of agricultural production in the US and the developed world is consolidated into large industrial farming operations that rely on economies of scale to streamline practices and maximize their yields and profits. For example, I've got a picture up here of a chicken in a factory farm and corn being grown as a biofuel crop. But there's tremendous diversity of agricultural systems around the world. And in many regions, production practices have been developed over centuries to be suited to the local climate conditions, soil types, and other ecological and social factors. So around the world, production practices have been changing quickly to keep pace with population growth. These increases in agricultural productivity have been enabled by new technologies as well as economic and political interests that have promoted the adoption of these new technologies and new practices. The Green Revolution is a term that's used to describe this boom in production tied to global adoption of high-yielding cereal crops, from hybridized seeds, synthetic fertilizers, so the industrial process that converts atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia in a form that can be used as fertilizer, taken up as a nutrient by plants, expanded irrigation, and expanded development and application of pesticides and herbicides. This is a graph taken from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, showing production of food by region between 1961 and 1999. The index of 100 refers to the base level production in 61, so any movement up or down on the graph can be interpreted as kind of percentage change in production. So you can see that world agricultural output increased by about 140% over the span illustrated on the graph. A lot of that production increase happened within Asia. And you also get a sense that production has been variable in a lot of these regions over time. So global expansion in agricultural production capacity has leveled off somewhat sort of since the turn of the century, since 2000. And this is due in a large part to the majority of available land for agriculture being utilized and converted to agricultural uses. So about 50% of habitable land surface is currently utilized for food production. And you can note here from this chart that while most of the calories and protein consumed by humans in the world comes from plant sources, the majority of agricultural land is devoted to livestock production. Also noting that not all land where livestock is raised or produced is actually viable for cropland production, but it's still interesting to note here. Okay, so as I hinted at in previous slides, there's a lot of complex feedbacks and interactions among food and energy and water resources globally. And as we look at the challenges in the current global food system and opportunities for systemic change and innovation to adapt to the impacts of climate change and to mitigate agriculture's contribution to global climate change, I think it's kind of useful to step back and understand the nature of these system interconnections and feedbacks. The chart here was something that I've put together and used in different settings with colleagues from Washington State University. And what it's really trying to illustrate is that the idea prior to industrialization of agriculture within agrarian societies, the primary source of energy for human consumption is plant biomass, which is created through the process of photosynthesis, and water use is kind of dictated directly by the crop water demand. And so in these pre-industrial agricultural systems, food, energy, water resources are managed in a very holistic, integrated manner. Technologies introduced through the process of industrialization have led to the separation of management decision-making surrounding these resources. So for example, we get electrical energy from hydropower, use mechanized tractors for cultivation, and other equipment that runs on fossil fuel-based energy, and water is effectively transported around the world. So some people may be familiar with alfalfa that's grown in California for cattle, and then essentially becomes virtual water transported through the food system. As the global population grows, stressors expand, and the scope and complexity of management within each sector expands. So in this context, I think you can kind of make a compelling case that we need to return to more integrated management systems and more integrated thinking about these systems. And some of that includes drawing on indigenous practices alongside thinking about technological and institutional innovation for regenerative agriculture. So the slide here is from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's Food Initiative, which was recently announced as kind of an example of a private foundation effort to support a global shift towards regenerative agricultural and food systems. It's based on the principles of a circular economy. This particular initiative really focuses on cities, noting that 80% of the world's food will be consumed within cities by the year 2050. And it emphasizes approaches such as sourcing food that's been grown regeneratively, diversifying the food supply, reducing packaging, shortening supply chains, and recycling food byproducts into organic fertilizers and bioenergy. And the initiative also really suggests that the public and private sector can work together to change food design and marketing and reshape consumer behaviors around food. I think these ideas hold promise, and it's kind of exciting to see movements emerging from different sectors of society that are aiming to harness the power of transformations in food and agricultural systems to address global climate change as well as human health and well-being inequalities worldwide. I want to return now to the point that around the world, the populations who are least responsible for the effects of global climate change are also typically bearing the greatest burden from its impacts. So these images are from Guatemala, where a combination of drought and agricultural policies have forced families to leave their land. Some of these policies related to the conversion of land that was growing corn to be converted to palm and sugarcane for biofuels markets in the US and in Europe. And so I think as Becca will talk more in her presentation coming up next, there are really clear relationships between climate disruption and food insecurity and global patterns of migration in response to that. So these systems are of human design, and at the same time, the inequalities and climate change impacts are contributing to vulnerabilities in agricultural systems and food access around the world. I want to emphasize that there are significant opportunities to question the assumptions about what efficient production systems look like and to redesign our institutions to support the goals of food sovereignty and ecological and societal resilience. So as you'll hear more from colleagues presenting tonight, many of the solutions I think already exist or are being developed and tested and deployed around the world. There are opportunities to address food waste, and there's growing demand, and to address the growing demand for animal protein, and to reconsider the question of how much more food we need to produce with reference to the question of how we are currently using the food that we are producing globally. Much of this effort also hinges on soil restoration and conservation. Agriculture is one of the only industries that can pull carbon out of the atmosphere. And so through conservation tillage practices There's considerable opportunities to increase the amount of CO2 sequestered in agricultural soils. Focusing on soil health is also a strategy to reduce reliance on synthetic fertilizers. We can seek solutions to use water resources more efficiently and to draw on indigenous knowledges and production systems to manage food, water, and energy systems in a more integrated and holistic manner. So thank you all. Introduce you? Okay, wonderful.
Hi, everyone. How are y'all doing tonight? Good, I hope. Okay. Thank you, Liz, for getting us started. My name is Becca Berkey, and I wear a couple of different hats here at Northeastern. My main hat is overseeing community-engaged teaching and research here on campus, and so getting the opportunity to work with faculty and students from across the university, in addition to community partner organizations all across Boston and beyond, to make purposeful connections around the sorts of things that we can be partnering on to make change around the big problems that we see in our world. I also have the pleasure of teaching a food justice and community development course as part of the human services program, which falls under public policy here. So really excited to have the chance to chat with you all tonight about some of the things that I feel really passionately about in the food system. In viewing the other talks that have been part of this series so far, I think that a common theme that I recognized was, a lot of folks kind of saying, I didn't go into my life thinking, oh, I want to study climate change, right? I kind of came into this work because I'm interested in food, I'm interested in people, and being interested in both of those things kind of necessitates learning about and being interested in climate change. And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight. So I want to start out, and I like to start out talks, and even sometimes I start out my classes this way, but I want you to just take a minute. We all eat, right? This is something we all have in common as human beings. I want you to think about your very favorite meal. Maybe it's something that you grew up eating. Maybe it's something you eat with your family now. I want you to think about just in your mind, conjure up what this wonderful meal is. And maybe this is kind of a mean activity to do at dinner time when not that many people are eating in here, but we're going to do it anyway. So think about some food. And now I want you to think about these questions. What are all of the ingredients that go into that meal? And all of the ingredients, every spice that's in that, every, not just ice cream on your cake at dessert, but what's in ice cream? Think about all the different ingredients that are in there. Now I want you to think about, where did they come from? How are they cultivated? Do you know? If I had you write all of these down, would you be able to say, the coriander comes from, where it comes from in the world and how it's cultivated? Who has interacted with those ingredients as you think about what your favorite meal is? What forces shape the lives of those who have interacted with your food along the way? And what are the environmental impacts of how that food was cultivated, processed, transported, and prepared? This isn't every meal and every bite we take. There are so many stories that are connected with that food. So I asked this question, how much do you know about how your food comes to be? When you think about that meal, it turns out for the average person, we actually don't know that much, and we don't think about it that much. We have food in our culture and in our society. If you have means, you are able to get whatever you want to eat, whatever you want to eat it. I see my colleague Chris Basso in the back of the room, and that's one of his lines, and it always sticks with me. And it also turns out that not knowing a lot about our food system may be somewhat intentional. I appreciate this little comic. Want to just put a little levity in here, just to give us a little laugh, even though it's also sad. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit tonight, and I think Dr. Allan's comments kind of set me up really well for the sort of things that I'm going to be talking about, and hopefully that will segue really nicely into our next speakers So to talk a little bit about agriculture and climate change, and as you were hearing in Liz's remarks, what we eat is responsible for about 1/3 of atmospheric warming. And so when we think about climate change, when we think about food, this thing that we all interact with, usually at least 3 times a day. If you're me, more like 6 or 7, depending on how really hungry I am. This is a huge contributor to climate change. I have this quote up here, just to give, and I'll have different quotes throughout because I really want to honor folks who do really amazing work in this field. So recognizing, as we heard in the previous talk, that food and agriculture sits in a unique position, both as a major contributor to climate change and as a sector that is being impacted and stands to be really impacted by climate change. And as such, as you heard in the talk before mine, it also offers some potential as a solution for climate change as well. And you'll get to hear a lot about the specifics of soil from our next speakers too. So just to put it another way, I'm the type of person, I remember things better if I get to hear them a couple of different ways. So the same global food system that's making us sick, it's increasing food insecurity and polluting the environment, is also contributing to the climate crisis. This is something to take really seriously. The climate crisis, in turn, is also contributing to hunger and food insecurity. But food can and must, I would argue, be part of the solution. So, another quote here. We can think of ourselves as a vital part of our food system, not just as eaters, but also as citizens. What can we do beyond our plate to help create a truly climate-friendly food system? So this is work by Anna Lepe, whose mother also did a lot of work around food system change. And I'll talk about some solutions tonight because I want people to walk away with some actionable items that it feels like we can kind of take on as individuals, but also want to recognize that there is a whole breadth of things in the policy and political economic realm that I'm not even going to touch on tonight. So I'm going to talk about things, and people who are in or have taken my class before are going to be familiar with this framework. I like to kind of break down thinking about the food system in its kind of requisite parts. So what does it mean to get food different places? What does it mean to produce our food? What happens to our food waste? And how do people access food? So I'm going to talk specifically about some of these dimensions and as they relate to climate change briefly. So food distribution. So going back to this, we see this apple with the boat and the plane and the truck. I think a lot of us are familiar with the concept of food miles, calculating our food miles, thinking about that meal we were talking about earlier, and considering how far our food had to travel. However, as useful of a tool as that is, that's really only part of the story about what goes into food distribution. So this part really, I think, illustrates well, and I know it's going to be hard for folks to see because there's a lot of information in this chart. I did share a link to my slides and links to all of the resources that I pulled this information from for tonight, so certainly get on the Open Classroom website to find those. But if you look at this, it's all different sorts of food, and thinking about the production and taking into account the land use change that's associated with producing it, the farm, what is happening on the farm, what's happening with animal feed. So particularly around animal production, there are emissions that are also associated with producing the food to feed the animals. What happens and what emissions are created by processing that food. Many foods, as we know, are not ready to eat in their natural form. Many foods are as well. Transporting it, which, like I said, is kind of the traditional part of food distribution that we think about. The food miles, where does our food come from? Retail and the different emissions that are associated with refrigeration, which was mentioned in the previous talk, and the packaging that goes along with our food. And so when we think about how food is distributed, it's a much more complex story than just how far does it travel to get to us. So you can see the impacts of these different parts of the supply chain on the greenhouse gas emissions of these different various types of food. So we can see here, and you'll see this come up again and again, beef being a very high contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And that is largely because you can see here the land use change, but also on farm, the methane emissions that come from cattle, are huge contributors to greenhouse gas emissions and therefore to climate change. So again, I just tell this because I think that we tend to oversimplify this concept of food distribution, and there's a lot more complexity to that story than we often talk about. So food access, like I said, this is another dimension of the food system that I think it's really important to address. As we heard in Liz's talk, and as we'll hear, I'm sure, reflected in the talks that Jack and Julie are going to give to follow, the very same communities that are most impacted by climate change, and I know that's been a theme with the speakers here, are also those that are more likely and most likely to be experiencing higher rates of food insecurity. As folks may or may not know, food insecurity can take a number of different forms. It can be, I can't afford food. It can also be there isn't an availability within a geographical range of the types of foods that are going to keep me healthy. And not being able to access food is a huge public health issue, and it is exacerbated by climate change. There's a lot going on in this chart, so I'm going to break it down in the next one, but I did want to show it because I think that there's a lot of really interesting information here. So we look at this chart and we can see the relationship between climate change and food security. Some of the different drivers of global warming, how that's impacting then specifically what's happening on farms, how that's changing what assets we have in general within the food system, driving migration, conflict, nutrition, so on and so forth. So breaking this big chart down, which again, I have the reference that they can give access to. To put it another way, the impacts of these different things, so greater weather variability, the carbon dioxide fertilization effects, the different things that you were hearing about in the talk before mine, has measurable impacts on food system assets, the different activities within our food system, food security outcomes, human well-being, which is intricately linked to food, and what options are even available when we think about adaptation, resilience, and different responses. So this quote over here, I think, illustrates this well. So climate change will affect all 4 dimensions of food security, which are named here as food availability, food accessibility, food utilization, and food system stability. It will have an impact on human health, livelihood assets, food production and distribution channels, as well as changing purchasing power and market flows. Its impacts will be both short-term, resulting from more frequent and more intense extreme weather events, and long-term, caused by changing temperatures and precipitation patterns. People who are already vulnerable and food insecure are likely to be the first affected. Food waste, another dimension of our food system. Food waste is a huge issue. And I'm always blown away by the fact and figure that 20%, upwards of 20%, probably even more than that, because we tend to estimate lower when things are hard to measure. But even that figure is astounding, that 1/5 of what Americans are purchasing for food is just thrown away. Either it's going bad, we are, paying attention to expiration dates that are kind of arbitrary in nature. We're buying things we don't need. We're not finishing what we have. And so a ton of this food that's being cultivated and causing all of these different effects is going straight in the landfills. And those landfills are also creating methane emissions, which are contributing to global climate change. And so food waste is a huge issue. You can see here, and this is pulled from a report, that if food loss and waste were its own country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter. So food loss and food waste, I think, I'm a social scientist and I study human interactions with these systems, and so I feel like food waste is something that I spend a little less time on, but it is a huge contributor when we're thinking about global climate change and how it interacts with our food system. So here's another chart that, again, I think does a nice job of illustrating some of the things that are happening when we waste food. So I'm not going to read all of these things to you, but you can kind of take a look at this. We're wasting energy that could be used. We're wasting water because most food is mostly made of water, and therefore that is contributing to that problem. And again, emissions are very high around food waste. Additionally, and a lot of the work that I've done has been with farmers and specifically thinking about farm workers, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But a lot of food waste actually is happening before food is even getting to our grocery stores. And so because of the dynamics of our food system, many times if, there isn't a market for food, or if food is, I'm sure we've heard about the ugly produce movement, and those. So if food doesn't meet certain standards and specifications, sometimes it's left to rot in fields. Sometimes it is maybe not making it to and through the grocery chain. So a lot of food waste, yes, is that we're throwing out 20% of what we buy, but also a lot of food waste is coming from before it even reaches us. My class works with a local organization, or they'll hear from a local organization called Boston Area Gleaners. I don't know if anyone's familiar with them, but they're a local organization that they actually have relationships with different farmers in the region, and they go out and they collect produce that is otherwise just going to be left in the field to rot. They distribute that, and so there are some innovative solutions that are happening, but again, much of our food gets wasted before it even kind of makes it to us. So food production, and that maybe logically is where I would have started, but food production is really where I spend my time thinking and doing research. And so I'm really interested in human interactions with our food production system, and specifically labor within that system. So when we think about farm labor, so I'll get a little bit more specific about this particular one, since it is the thing that I spend the most time thinking about. So for folks who aren't familiar with how food is cultivated in our country, there are 2.4 million or more folks working as farm workers in the U.S. And when I'm talking about a farm worker, I'm not talking about the farm owner or the kind of pastoral image that comes to mind. I'm talking about the folks that are cultivating what's happening. They are likely about 60 to 85%. I know it's a wide range, but again, it's a difficult to track population. Between 60 and 85% are from outside of the United States. And so this makes this a particularly vulnerable population. And the reason I'm talking about this in a series about climate change is going back to some of those comments about more vulnerable populations becoming the most vulnerable due to climate change, as farm workers are among those folks. So the reliance on pesticides that we were hearing a little bit about before, not only are we needing more pesticides because of climate change and the proliferation of pests, but those same pesticides then are contributing to future climate change. And who is on the front lines of exposure to those pesticides but farm workers, the people that are actually on the land? And as you can see, based on the estimates of how many folks are from outside the U.S., many times English is not their first language. They aren't necessarily educated on what sort of harmful outcomes there can be related to that. In addition to that, as we've seen temperatures rise, global temperatures rise, this population becomes particularly vulnerable because their work is outside or it's in greenhouses, which I don't know if anyone spent a lot of time in greenhouses, but they're hot anyway. And so As the world gets hotter, it becomes even more and more dangerous. And heat doesn't even have to be extreme to be dangerous, because a lot of times there isn't a shady place, there isn't access to water, so on and so forth. And so a slight warming makes the already dangerous conditions more dangerous. Farm workers also are excluded from a lot of the legal protections that are afforded to other classes of workers. Again, don't have time to go into all of that. Happy to answer questions about it. But in general, they're not afforded the same protections as many other workers. So another way of putting this, and I think this is a really essential point, that the very people, so Liz was talking about how as all of these changes happen, folks who have been able to exist by subsistence farming, family farming in their home countries, they're displaced by the climate change that's happening. They're displaced by other things as well, trade policy, so on and so forth. So they are forced to migrate. They migrate. What are their skills? They know how to farm. So they become farm workers, and they farm in the very system that's creating the climate change that displaced them in the first place, right? And so it's this really unbelievable and heart-rendering, I think, for those of us that haven't worked in that system, thing to kind of think about. Imagine being displaced and then becoming complicit in the very system that displaced you in the first place. Among all of these other issues that I was talking about. So is organic agriculture the solution? We hear a lot about organic agriculture. Even though agriculture, even if organic agriculture is part of the solution, I think it's important to note that only about 1% of the farms in the United States and about 4% of the farmland in the United States is farmed organically or using organic practices, at least as certified or exempt from certification. So even if or even though organic agriculture is part of the solution, and I think, I live in my bubble where I can go to a farmer's market. I've been really fortunate to work with the Northeast Organic Farming Association, feels very mainstream to me. But really, when you're looking at the full political economic system of agriculture, organic agriculture is just a very, very small part of what's actually happening. So can it be part of the solution? Certainly, but it may not be as prolific as many of us think, given our own familiarity with it. Additionally, the plight of the small and family scale farmer within the broader political economic landscape of agriculture further complicates the story. So when we're thinking about what are the ways to kind of approach this, we really are able to see some hope. And I am a social scientist, but who also likes to believe, I'm like the eternal cautious optimist, and I like to believe that there are things that we can draw from and learn from that can give us hope. And so there are a number of intersectional movements that are happening around this, where folks who have been climate justice activists, environmental justice activists, food justice, food sovereignty folks are coming together, and they're thinking about approaches, and not just approaches to mitigate climate change, but to center the voices and the wisdom of those who have not been privileged within these systems. So centering racial, gender, and economic justice, and really thinking only about solutions that will address and redress historic inequities. And so this is a place we can draw some hope from. So what does this look like? So Liz talked a little bit about regenerative agriculture. There are a number of different approaches to thinking about how agriculture can do these things. One piece that I pull from, in addition to regenerative agriculture, is agro ecology. I think this is an approach to agriculture that a lot of folks are drawing from, and it considers more holistically the different dimensions that are part of agricultural production. And so how do we think about the economic, political, environmental, and sociocultural dimensions of our food production, And how do we do that in a way that builds solidarity, honors indigenous knowledge, and really not just produces food in better ways, but also breaks down some of the systems that have kept us from doing that in the first place. So when we think about agroecology, we're really thinking about something that places in the hands of local producers and farmers the power, right? Which is a fundamental shift of what our food system looks like currently. I think this graphic is really interesting. So this is a century ago in 1903, the number of different varieties of these particular produce. And then looking at 1983, 2001, we can see that the diversity of even just these different items of the seeds that we are cultivating, which has a lot of the impacts that Liz was talking about, monoculture, stripping the soil, so on and so forth. And so as we've seen less variety in our food, we need to look back to the folks who know how to do this. They know how to do it well. So what can you do? I want to, like I said, leave you with some at least personal tips and tricks, because I know this feels really big and overwhelming. So again, pulling from Anna Lapay's work, Diet for a Hot Planet. Some of the things that are suggested, and we could unpack each of these, but we don't have time to do that, at least yet, maybe during the question and answer. But you can see these 7 principles. So when you're thinking about some of the problems I just talked about, most of these principles are doing the opposite of those things. So thinking more about where your food comes from, thinking about what are ways that you can reduce packaging, what are ways that you can cook more and grow more on your own, eat more plants. It doesn't mean you can't eat meat, but eat more plants, support local economies, and reaching for real food as much as possible. Someone I really admire, Vandana Shiva, who is a huge food sovereignty activist. I think this is a really powerful quotation. If all you have is a no, you're not strong enough. And then she goes on to say, you must do the work that it takes. You can't wait for governments and corporations to make the shift. People must. So thinking back to your favorite meal, and again, I'm doing that mean thing of showing pictures of delicious looking food during a time when you may be hungry. But thinking back to your favorite meal, go back to that in your mind. I talked about it at the beginning. And just think about learning more about it, where the food and the ingredients that are in it come from, and the way that they kind of come to you. I think one of the most powerful ways each of us can make a change is to learn more about the systems that we're complicit in, even though we're not choosing necessarily to be complicit in them. And so I think with what you like to eat is a really great place to start. And with kind of one thought here, and this is a lot of words to kind of take in, but just want to reiterate some of the thoughts that we've had around, and you've heard it in both of our talks now, and I know it'll be woven in, but really we need a climate justice approach that centers frontline communities. And so those that are going to be most impacted, to help them, or to have them help lead the struggle, or to have them lead the struggle, in identifying solutions that work for them, that honor their knowledge, and in taking back control over our local food systems. It's a complicated graphic, but I wanted to end with this, a strategy framework for just transition. I think a lot of the themes from it relate to the graphic that Liz showed in her talk, but how do we move from this extractive economy into a more living economy? And I think our food system can be a way that we begin to do that, even in other parts of our economic system as well. I have more information. Like I said, I shared these resources and slides, so hopefully these will be up on the website for people to access. And now I'm going to introduce our next speakers, and I just want to personally, thank them for being here, and then also thank them for the contribution they've had in my thinking around food systems. So Jack Kittredge and Julie Rawson are longtime farmers, and I think that they have seen they have seen, food systems and farming from a number of different perspectives. And so want to turn it over to them because I think they're really the experts around what this looks like and have done countless, hours of activism and research, both around soil health, which is what Jack will talk about, as well as how to become more active in our food systems and really make a difference. So I'm going to turn it over to two friends of mine, Jack and Julie.
Well, I hope to be able to be a little bit more encouraging. I know both those presentations presented a good picture of what the existing food system is like. And can people hear me all right? A little bit more in the back? Okay, thanks. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the more encouraging aspects of things that we have found. My wife and I, as Becca said, have a farm in Barre, Massachusetts. It's out past Worcester, and we started that farm in 1984, shortly after we moved out there with our 4 kids, and have been family farming there ever since. We also are very active in NOFA, the Northeast Organic Farming Association, and that's the organization that we have been working to try to get our ideas about how farming can be, in fact, more helpful to people rather than a net drain on our resources out there. And some of the work that we've been doing, I think, would be very interesting and helpful to you. I prepared a little bit of a PowerPoint that's based on a paper that we have published. It's available about soil carbon restoration. Can biology do the job? And I want to say that that's available for free on the internet, or we brought some copies here if people want to take them home and selling them for $2 a piece. But I think it may be something that if what I have to say interests you, you want to follow up on, and we can talk about that later. If I can figure out how this clicker works here. Oops. My wife is Julie Rawson. I'm Jack Kittredge. And this is our presentation. Basically, go through a very quick sense of the problems that we're seeing with weather anomalies. We're getting either too much rain or too much heat. Nowhere are we getting the kind of natural systems that we have normally grown to appreciate, particularly in the Northeast. And as you know well, it's a result of the buildup of greenhouse gases that trap heat in the atmosphere and don't let it escape to outer space. And of course, greenhouse gases have always been with us, but they have been a low level in the past. They've been at a level that prevents the planet from freezing, but in fact has enabled human life and other life to evolve. And now recently, in the last 200 or so years, industrialization has increased them to a level that now threatens life on Earth. And I think we don't need to talk about what the greenhouse effect is. You pretty well know that. Scientists generally have agreed that about 2/3 of the greenhouse effect is caused by combustion of fossil fuels, and about 1/3 is caused by the land clearing and other agricultural purposes of creating our food system. And now the greenhouse gases are over 400 parts per million, where they were about 280 during most of our evolution. Even if we were burning fossil fuels and we stopped altogether, it would probably take over 100 years for the atmosphere to clean up, because those greenhouse gases have a long endurance period. So even if all the recommendations that people have promoted about stopping the use of greenhouse gases and not adding any more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere happened, we still would be building up heat in the oceans. We'd still be melting ice in the glaciers. We have a real serious problem, and we need to not just think in terms of stopping emissions. We need to think in terms of actually putting carbon somewhere else than in our atmosphere. The primary things that we're talking about are the melting and the release of gases from the ocean, incorporation of gases in the ocean, but also the methane and permafrost is another example of the kind of thing that could be a serious problem. So what can we do? We need to put the carbon in the atmosphere somewhere else. And there are only basically two places on Earth we can put it, one of which is the ocean. And the ocean is already absorbing more carbon than it can take. And the carbon, when you put carbon into water, you get carbonic acid. And so the oceans are acidifying, and they are getting to the point where they're killing coral and many, many other forms of marine life. So we can't continue to put carbon into the ocean. And that leaves only one place to put it. And fortunately, that's the place where it came from, and that's the soil. And the soil is a tremendous, huge carbon sink. And the problem that faces us is how do we get carbon back into the soil, because we've been digging it out and pumping it out in various other ways and burning it, and we need to put it back in the soil. One fact about the soil that many people who are not farming or dealing with the soil all the time may not realize is that soil is a very active, living environment. Soil contains huge amounts of living organisms, microbes, primarily earthworms. They say about 1,000 pounds of living life exists under every acre of soil, just as on a farm, maybe 1,000 pounds, and cattle and so forth might exist on every acre above it. So when you look at a field, think also of what kinds of life is being supported underneath the field. And all that life is very, very hungry. We are all carbon consuming animals, and all that life has to have carbon to support itself. And if you think of the amount of pounds of organic matter in the soil, you begin to understand the microbial activity and how much it is supported and needs carbon to survive. Carbon, these microbes eat carbon. They exhale carbon dioxide just like us. They have a half-life. The half-life of a teaspoon of sugar, if you spread it in an active field, would be something under 60 minutes. That is, some organisms are going to consume that teaspoon of sugar that quickly. An acre of Iowa corn exhales something like the equivalent of 25 working men in carbon dioxide in a day. Food is usually a limiting factor in soil life expansion. So basically, the question is, how do we get carbon into soil? I think probably everyone here knows the answer, whether they've thought about this or not. We learned about it in grade school or high school, which is the process that plants go through to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, to take water out of the soil primarily, to separate them into carbon and oxygen and hydrogen, and to recombine them and make carbohydrates and oxygen, the very things that life needs to eat and to breathe. And that process is called photosynthesis, as you all well know. I think we all learned about it. We did not, I think, understand its power and its importance until quite recently. 15% of all the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere moves through plants annually in this process of photosynthesis. That is, in 7 years, the entire carbon dioxide component of the atmosphere has been passed through plants and been separated from carbon and dioxide. And the question is, how can we use this incredibly powerful biological force to sequester carbon in a more permanent fashion? What they didn't tell you, I think, certainly didn't tell me when I learned about photosynthesis in high school, was what happens to all that potential, that energy, that carbohydrates that are created by plants. And basically, somewhere around half in actively farmed agricultural fields, greater than half of those carbohydrates are no longer just put into the plant root and seed and so forth, but are actually exuded out of the plant roots as a liquid, as a sugary solution. You might call it a sap, a sugary sap, into the soil. Now, you might say, well, why in the world would any life form go to the trouble to make all this stuff and then exude it into the soil? There's some reason for it, and indeed there is. Very good reason. We talked about the soil being very hungry. Well, that's what feeds the microbes and the biological activity in the soil, is that exuded carbon from plants. Scientists have long known this and been studying it in universities, but they have not passed this information along to most of us who really can do something useful with that information. But basically, the plants exude that soil, the microbes eat it, the microbes multiply, they begin to flock around the roots of the rhizosphere, which is the area around the roots of the plants where that stuff is being exuded, and they want to increase that. They want to get more of it. They want to survive. Like any existing life form, it wants to increase the resources which are supporting it. Those organisms have certain abilities that I think we need to touch on to understand this story. Bacteria, probably those of you who are biologists or have studied life forms understand that bacteria are incredibly able chemists. They were the very first life form on Earth, we think. They were the ones that enabled the creation of many activities in other organisms. They're the basis, we now believe, of our energy modules in each human cell. They have many capacities in the soil organisms, and they have evolved many ways to help plants. And what they are able to do is to help the plants thrive, to become healthy, to resist disease. And as a result, those plants are able to, in turn, photosynthesize, exude more carbon, and you have a cycle in the soil that is one of the key things in what enables plants to be strong and healthy. It's called, basically symbiosis, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, where organisms help each other to survive. Fungi are another dominant organism in the soil. Fungi have the ability to create enormous by our, not by our standards, but by theirs. They have hypha, these long thread-like organs that extend many inches in the soil, through which they can transport water, they can transport diluted chemicals. Phosphorus, for instance, is very hard for plants to achieve. Phosphorus can be dissolved off of rock surfaces by enzymes that fungi produce, and the fungi then take those phosphorus molecules up, pass them along their hypha through water they've picked up in the soil, and release them near plant roots. The plants can get that phosphorus most cheaply, most easily from the fungi, so they release carbon to feed those fungi, and again, you have that symbiosis in the soil. Those are the kinds of things that I didn't learn about. I'm not sure that everybody here learned about them. Hopefully they did. Hopefully they've included that kind of stuff in high school chemistry and biology now, but I'm afraid many of them are not. And these are some of the more exciting things that we are beginning to understand. The question is now, how can we use this process, this huge energy of photosynthesis, and this symbiosis that exists between plants and microbes to, in fact, stabilize more carbon in the soil? And our conclusion is that we can, yes, indeed. That it's how you farm that makes all the difference. Now, when all the two previous presentations, most of them were about the existing methods of farming, which I agree are totally destructive of the soil, destructive of the water table, destructive of the atmosphere, and are contributing largely to the problems that we have. But that's not the only way we have to farm. That's not the only kind of way we can produce food. We can produce food in ways that do not destroy the soil, that in fact enable carbon to be sequestered in soil in large amounts. Probably the single most destructive thing that farmers do right now is tillage. That is to disturb the soil, not to cover it, to expose it. When you expose carbon to atmosphere, to oxygen, basically you quickly oxidize that carbon. It becomes carbon dioxide and it floats off as a gas. Now, if you don't expose that soil, you don't use tillage, you use mulches and you cover that soil, then you have a vastly lower possibility of that carbon, oxidation of the carbon in the soil. So that's a very simple thing that we are experimenting with, that a lot of organic farmers now in the Northeast, small-scale farmers, are trying to do a better job of. And it's just one small step of the kinds of things we can do. I want to conclude with talking about some of the other ways that we can sequester carbon, and maybe talk a little bit about the volumes that we can sequester in that way. Chemicals is another. When you use chemicals, you basically kill organisms in the soil. You kill pests. If you use herbicides, you often shut down the process that the plants are using to feed that symbiosis. The plant, if you use fertilizer, the plant says, "Why should I, exude carbon to those organisms in the soil to get the services I need when the farmer's bringing it out of a bag?" And so he shuts down that service, and you no longer have a healthy, alive soil. You begin to have a dead soil, and if you continue that for years, then there's no life left in that soil, and you have to reinvigorate it if you want to put in biological farming into place. So besides tillage, the use of chemicals, of toxic chemicals of all sorts, fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, is a terrible process for shutting down that symbiosis in the soil. You want to cover soil with green plants. If you're in a place like New England where we have harsh winters and you can't have year-round photosynthesis going on, you can at least use cover crops. You can plant your cover crops before your fall harvest. The cover crops come up. They are going to stay there through the winter. They are going to may not grow very rapidly, but they're going to cover that soil, and they will, depending on what crops they will add some carbon to the soil, and they may add nitrogen or other things if they're legumes. Livestock on soil, we have livestock on our farms, and we believe heavily that nature, created soil with both animals and plants on it, and that's what was intended, because the plants use the byproducts of the animal population, and the animal population uses the byproducts of the plant growth, and that's a perfectly natural way to do it. So we believe using animals and animal agriculture is pretty crucial. And basically, that's what we're trying to talk about. We're trying to talk about getting soil that looks like the soil on the right hand. If you're the person holding the soil, it's darker. It has those aggregates. And aggregates are the little raisin-sized particles where soil is formed by glues created by fungi, and those little aggregates are sort of the clean rooms in which the bacteria work and do a lot of their processing, because they can exclude oxygen, they can exclude water, they can exclude the various things that interrupt their bacterial processing. I think that's time for my wife.
Hi. I have to say that I haven't looked at these slides for about a week, so I've forgotten completely what's on each one of them, but I'll build it as I go. And I did want to say something about cows. I know that Becca particularly was talking about beef production and methane gas and all those things, but I would like to say that there are a lot of people out there. Allan Savory, you may have heard of this, Savory Institute. They're the other group, the Holistic Management Institute, HMI. There's a wonderful book called Cows Save the Planet, Judith Schwartz. I'd like you all to read that, because I truly believe, I think most of us in this movement truly believe that ruminants are really the answer, not the problem. And the problem is when you put any animal in a CAFO system, which is the concentrated animal feeding operation, then they first of all aren't eating what they should be eating, which in the case of ruminants is grass plants, etc. And they don't do well on grains, and so they do become methane producers. Interestingly, though, and here's another little fun fact, that methane does not come out of the cow's butt, but it comes out of its mouth. And when a cow is eating grass, then right away, as soon as the cow starts to eat and the methane is produced, there are these little guys called methanotropes that kind of appear however these things happen. And it's amazing how the right organisms show up at the right time, and they actually will eat that methane. So that's information that people should know, and that Really, when you think about the bison and the American, the Great Plains and the Velds in Africa, those very, very, very nutritious, healthy ecosystems were built in conjunction with animals eating grass. And it's all about animals eating grass and doing it in a fashion where they're just there for a short period of time in a large group it's called mob stocking. And the reason that they were in those groups is because you have the wolves or the tigers or the lions or whatever, depending on where you are, all around the outside of this group of animals, and coming in and taking out the old ones or the young ones or whatever. And that's why animals would be in a place like this in a very concise area. They'd eat it, they'd pee on it and poop on it, and then they'd move on to the next spot, and they wouldn't come back until the grass had grown back and there was more food to eat. And interestingly, those situations where you can have maximum photosynthesis in those situations, which are properly managed in a mob stocking or very intensely managed grazing systems, you can bring back old hay fields and bring back desertified areas. Allan Savory has shown how that they can really bring back deserts and bring them back into production again. So just something to think about, because I know there's a lot of bad press out there about cows, but I'd like you to read that other side of the picture and really understand that too, and think about the fact that before we were around, those were probably the animals that were doing the most soil building and carbon sequestering. So, sorry, little digression that wasn't on here. And besides being the main farmer at Many Hands Organic Farm in Barrie, which I'd love to have you all come out and visit if you'd like. You can come and work for a day and have breakfast and lunch. I'm also the executive director of the Northeastern Organic Farming Association Massachusetts chapter. We have 7 chapters in the Northeast, and there's another sister organization which you may have heard of, the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners, which is in Maine. And basically for the last 40, I guess it's almost 50 years now, these organizations have been really a place for farmers to learn how to be better farmers. And it's a wonderful bootstrap organization where we learn from each other. We certainly bring in outsiders from other parts of the country and the world to come and help us, advance our understanding of how to do things. But it's a really wonderful grassroots organization. And we started out really as more of a farmers organization, but really do a lot of work with gardeners and in urban settings. And we work a lot with homesteaders, people who are really interested in just, raising food for themselves, people who want to learn about food preservation, self-reliance, all those kinds of things. And I think one of the beauties of NOFA is that it's a group of people who really have a different we kind of live outside the system. We believe in really taking charge of our lives and really, not eschewing, technology, but just using it appropriately and trying to meld the wonderful things that technology bring us with, the understanding really that it's about nature and nature's processes. And we have to remember that we are not dominating nature. We are trying to dominate nature, but, in the end, nature wins when you try to dominate it. And so it's really about becoming a very humble junior partner to nature as opposed to trying to dominate nature. So that's kind of what we're about. And so I would love you all to join. We say, even though there's that word farmer in the name, farming in the name, we're an organization for anybody who eats. And so we figure that would be all of you. So we also do a lot of supportive policy initiatives. Right now we're working on glyphosate bans. Everybody here know what glyphosate is? Just raise your hand if you know what that is. Yeah, it's not so many folks. Glyphosate is one of the most egregious, yes, it's Roundup, one of the most egregious chemicals out there right now, because it's so ubiquitous. And they're the folks who, you've probably seen something about some of the lawsuits that have been out with people dying of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and they've won a lot of court cases. We'll see if they actually ever get the money, but they've been, winning a lot of court cases. Glyphosate's everywhere. It's in everything. It's on almost all of your food. Even if it's not being used along with genetically modified organisms to raise your food, it's also used as a desiccant to come in and dry down your food so that harvest can proceed much more quickly. So things that people thought, well, oats are okay, wheat's okay, it's not GMO, but the fact is that those crops, chickpeas, a lot of beans, all those things have been dried down with glyphosate, and so they also become poisonous. Autism, Alzheimer's, the long list of terrible diseases that people in our culture are getting now, obesity, heart disease, all these things that have skyrocketed. There are plenty of nasty chemicals out there, and some of them are worse than glyphosate. It just happens to be the most ubiquitous one. So anyway, we're working in the state legislature, and you might see us. We're going to have a drive-in day on February 12th, and this one is not exactly about glyphosate, but actually to support some healthy soil legislation, which we're working on with a lot of other organizations in Mass to get the state behind healthy soils legislation, which will help farmers move more quickly into a place where they can really be more carbon sequesterers and, adding to the positive answers to our climate solution. All right. And we're also, I think one of the other exciting things about our policy work is that we're working with towns and cities to transform their management of their municipal lands to organic systems. So playing fields, town centers, all that stuff, getting the chemicals out of there and transforming those to organic management. So it's across the board. Let's see, what else do we say? So we do and have been really since about 2014 working very hard on learning ourselves and teaching others as we go about how to grow healthy carbon sequestering crops. Conferences, workshops, reference pages. We have this page, www.nofmas.org/carbon. You can, lots of videos on there and resources if you really want to get deeply into this and really understand carbon sequestration. Very exciting. I think, climate change is very scary, and I suspect it's probably scarier for those of you who, figure I'll probably be dead before the earth burns up, and some of you probably won't be dead when it burns up, and so that's probably pretty scary to you. But I think the good news is that we can really, we all really can, and we can turn this around if we really start to understand that it's through raising food in a good fashion and keeping our landscapes diverse, et cetera, that we can really turn this around quickly. And so in NOFA, you can make connections to farmers for work opportunities. Some of you might want to be doing that in the summertime, working on a farm and really getting your hands dirty, as it were. For carbon sequestering food. So learning how to eat in a carbon sequestering fashion every day. If we all do that, if every time, and as Becca pointed out, if you really think about every single thing that you put in your mouth and start to learn where it came from and start to actually find foods that came from a carbon sequestering farm somewhere, when that kind of explosion of energy from the consumers in the world happens, then the farmers who aren't yet doing that are going to turn those things around. And it's also the mega corporations. They always want to get on the action, and they'll be doing something other than raising, millions of acres of corn for ethanol production in the Midwest. They'll figure it out that this is where the money is, and a lot of them already are. General Mills is a good example of a company that's really starting to move in that direction. The business interests are about making money. They want to be on that bandwagon when it comes. So that's what we can all do. What about at Northeastern? Research creative models at other universities about starting a farm. I know you don't have a whole lot of grass here. I noticed outside that you have a lot of big, tall buildings, but there are a lot of places, New York City is one of them, where people actually have gardens on top of buildings. So, that's one place you can go. But I saw all those wonderful little circles out there with trees. Wouldn't it be fun to have a vegetable garden under each one of those trees? And really, people will stop and ask and, really learn and understand. Or maybe some beehives, or maybe even some goats or something. I think it would be really fun to start a farm here. I don't know what happens with all your food here that is served, but, is it being composted? Is it being turned back into fertilizer? Good thing to work on and make sure that that kind of thing is happening. Make sure that all food served is organic and carbon sequestering. I know a lot of universities have had to go to organic food because their students have demanded it. And you guys are, dropping $50,000 a year now? I don't know how much it is, but you're dropping a lot of money for this education. And you can, this is one of the things that you should be demanding, that all the food served here is raised in a carbon sequestering fashion. You can call it organic, you can call it biological, you can call it ecological, you can call it agro ecological. They're, regenerative. Everybody's got a new word. Every week there's another new word out. But it's about putting more carbon back in the soil than is being taken out. That's the bottom line. Let's see, what else do we say? The lands and green spaces. So that's another one. I would be very interested, and it would be a great project for you to find out if chemicals are being used on the very small landscape that you have here. And if they are, they can be changed. There are hundreds actually of accredited organic land care professionals around this state who could help the university. And I know Harvard has a great project, and the Wellesley College and a few other places really are already doing this. So I don't know if you are or not, but it's a good thing to check into. So no chemicals, diverse landscapes that support diverse microbial partners underground. So that means perennials and annuals and animals and all those insects. We have this insect collapse. I'm sure you've all read about it, but they come back. It's amazing how they reappear on the scene when there's a life support system for them. No bare soil. I think that's one of the most important things that we can remember, that bare soil is anathema to a healthy world. And so it needs to be covered all the time. And grass shouldn't be so short either, because it can't, the shorter that grass is, the more it can't photosynthesize. So we're talking about, some tall things in there, some perennial flowers. We have this one space where we have New England wild asters. They're purple. They're very beautiful. And this year we planted them in a strip right inside our vegetable garden. And I went out one day, I think it was the 20th of September, and I just stood in there, a matter of 5 minutes. I saw 7 monarch butterflies land on these beautiful flowers. It's like, oh my God, that was the most remarkable day of 2019 for me. So perennials bring all sorts of fun people back into the situation. And here's another one: soil covered in growing plants at least 260 days of the year. And that's for farmers. I think for a place like this, the grass doesn't really die. So that's wonderful that you have, perennial grasses. And I think it would be great if you brought some chickens in and maybe some livestock too. So that's another idea that I have. And we all can have fresh eggs too. Be the change that you want for the world. Get outside and into nature and observe and emulate natural systems. Diversify your own gut biome with varied and roughage-rich foods. I don't know if you all have studied much about the microbiome in the soil, the microbiome in the body, and it's all the same. It's the same kind of deal. We're only like 10% of our bodies is us. So our DNA, the rest of 90% is really microbes, and so we're really running the show. And support diversity in all things, from inside of you to the world as you interface with it. That may be the end. Yes.
I think one of the big takeaways when we're learning about food systems and climate change for me has always been that humans have become incredibly disconnected from the natural world. And I think Jack and Julie have reminded me that we have also become disconnected from our farmers. And I so appreciate the perspective that you have brought here tonight. I'm going to start with an issue that I always think about with food systems, because I think it's one of the entry points for a lot of people into thinking about this, because it seems so tangible and familiar to us. And you mentioned it with the butterflies, pollinators, and how issues of biodiversity are also coming into play here, and what that means for us in terms of losing pollinators and the diversity of crops they represent, and what that means for us moving forward if we don't find ways to secure that particular incredible actor in food systems.
I'm going to let the farmers handle that. Sounds like you.
Well, honeybees are hard to raise. We have tried many years. We have some now. We're struggling with them, but fortunately, honeybees are not the only pollinators, or we would all be in a lot of trouble. There are many, many natural pollinators that you may not know. Honeybees actually came to this continent late with the white man, I guess, and the settling of the Western Hemisphere late, and natural pollinators have been here a long time, and they are some bees and many other insects. But certainly the pollination services that we get from bees, which are particularly effective and efficient and well adapted to that, and these other pollinators are crucial to getting good. Otherwise, we'd be depending on wind and on hand pollination and so forth, which would be terribly ineffective. So just as a practical measure, we need to think very carefully about them.
I'm just going to say that I think one of the things that most of us are taught is to keep a neat and tidy place if you live in the suburbs. Particularly, I know you're under extreme pressure to get rid of all your dandelions and have your grass cut really short and all those things and look like your neighbors. And I feel sorry for folks who live in the suburbs, because I know the pressure is very great on you. But, the idea of turning your yard, if you have one, into a multi-species perennial garden is one of the ways that you can really, support the pollinators. I know some of the cities, and there's so much activity on pollinator protection right now. Again, that's some of the stuff that we're working on in the State House, along with a number of other organizations, but trying to set up pollinator corridors so that, they can get from one town to the next, basically, and without having to try to go through, chemical land, I guess. But those little habitats that, and again, that's something you all could do here at Northeastern, is make sure that all those circles out there under those trees, they could be, loaded up with perennial plants. It would make that a reality here.
Yeah, we have a question from online. I think it's directed to Julie about beef in general, and just if the idea that if we need to reduce our beef consumption, or we continue to keep our beef consumption the same level that it is now. Just referencing what you were saying with cows.
Yeah, I would say that what we need to make sure is that our ruminants are being raised in a fashion that supports their ultimate health. And to that extent, you're going to be building the soil, and you're going to be building a very healthful product for people to eat. So it's about, getting rid of all those CAFOs. And I don't know if you remember, this isn't beef, but you remember when the one of the hurricanes came through in North Carolina, was it a year and a half ago? And, all that, the water came up, the pigs were like all dying in these CAFOs, and then that whole area of North Carolina was just a swamp of hog shit, essentially, and poisoning the entire, area. So that's what happens. You get a climate crisis like that, and then you have a more severe crisis, and you have huge issues with people dying from, all this toxic waste, essentially. So the answer is to get rid of the CAFOs and only raise as many cows as the land can support.
Ed? Do you have a question? I just wanted to add one thought to that. I know there's a lot of talk about the role of methane in beef production, particularly. Oh, did you? Okay. I won't bother that then. But there's some very good studies that if anybody's interested, I'd be happy to cite afterwards. You want to come up?
Bottom line on cows, we love cows. We don't love the way cows are treated in our food system, and that certainly contributes to climate change and all of these other disasters as well.
Hi, thank you all so much for your time tonight. I have a question about the value, if you see any, in trendy synthetic meats. If something like the Beyond Burger or the Impossible Burger has a piece in the puzzle of lowering meat consumption, especially in the context of rapidly developing economies like China or India.
So the answer, I think, is to eat real food. You know, and if you can't pronounce it, for sure don't eat it. But really, it's about eating real food, and it's not about eating too much meat or too little meat. It's not about not eating corn, but you shouldn't be eating GMO corn because then you're supporting this whole destructive system in our environment. You know, all these grains that are being raised with GMOs and with glyphosate are extremely toxic for the environment. So if you think about it that way, some of those, vegetable-based things, people have always said, eating vegetarian is the way to God, because you're doing a thing that's friendly to the environment. But it really is only friendly to the environment if it's raised in a fashion that's really supporting that carbon sequestration again. I don't know if that answered your question.
I agree with everything Julie just said, and the other thing that I would add to that is, there is this human element of, how were the ingredients that are in the Impossible Burger, farmed, who was farming those, whose hands did those touch, and so I think that it's not as simplistic as, just not eating meat changes the system, right? Like you really do, the more that you can know about where that food comes from, because, I value animals, I also value people, and so having a better idea of who's touching that, what conditions it was produced under, so on and so forth. And the more that you do what Julie is saying, which is eat real food, that you know where it comes from and you can pronounce all of the things that are in it, the more you're going to know about what conditions those were produced under. And so I think thinking as well about those human elements and dimensions to our food system is another part of that equation too.
Thank you. Everyone here tonight spoke a lot about agriculture, and I was curious if anyone up there could speak more to food access and the supply chain, especially with the increasing severity and frequency of disasters. Professor Landsmark in our class before mentioned that if Boston, for example, was hit by a large storm, our current supermarkets can only sustain us for at most 3 days without influx of more food. So if our transportation infrastructure, for example, is just wiped out by a storm like that, how do you suggest communities prepare for this?
So it's an excellent question, and any of us in the Boston area have probably had this experience of like the news report says the storm's coming and you go and everyone's trying to buy their milk and bread and they're depleted off the shelves. And I think that this is a problem and an issue that has so many components to it. But one aspect that I think is so critical and is partially addressed by any of these food movements that really emphasize knowing where our food comes from and knowing about its production is that if we build regional food systems where there is markets developed for food produced locally, I think it all moves us towards a system where there's, I guess what I'm sort of rambling to say is that urban communities will always be dependent on more rural land bases for our food production, but to the degree that we understand those connections and understand those relationships of interdependence, I think we can develop planning and policy that's, works towards addressing that, and it and works towards this kind of issue of using the food that we do have more efficiently. And there's some exciting developments happening in the realm of, using emerging technologies, Internet of Things type innovations to understand the supply chain of food and sort of do more real-time management of distribution chains. And for I think sometimes there's promise for more efficiency and equity in those systems with that transparency. And so
I just had a couple things too, and I really think everybody who has any land base at all can raise food, and you can raise sprouts on your kitchen counter, if you don't have, and like I said, we used to live in Dorchester actually. We were there 75 to 82, and we had a 10 by 40 yard, and we had rabbits, and we had a compost pile, and we had vegetable garden in the entire yard. So although I grew up on a farm, I spent 10 years in the city, and I have some experience with raising food in the city. But I also wanted to say that it's important for you all to understand the cost of good food and to be able and to feel good about paying that money for that good food. We do live in a country of cheap food, and Jack can probably give you the better figures on that. But one of the things that we have to do is to really start paying for our food and making it more of our budgets. And by the way, when we do that, we'll end up with less of those nasty diseases that everybody's getting. So it's kind of paying up front for your health care as opposed to paying for it later.
Just in America, I think I would support that totally. We have a very cheap food policy. In America, apparently, according to figures of the government, about 6% of the average family income is used to buy food. And in Europe, it's something between 12 and 15%. And again, those are, very affluent Western societies. And in most of the world, people are paying 40, 50, even 60% of their income for food. So if you look at what you're getting for food and you're complaining about it, I would say you need to think twice about the price of food and what you're actually getting. And if you buy cheap, you're probably getting pretty cheap food. It's not worth it. And our sense is it's worth it to pay for good food, because that's basically what makes for health and makes for a good farming society, and that makes for a good place to live.
I think also that when you all start paying for your food, there'll be more of us farmers right outside the city wanting to bring it in for you. Because, very few of us are breaking even or making any money at all. We're doing it because we like to.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add to that is thinking about how equity fits into that, and so access to that sort of food and paying a higher price. And I think that there are some really interesting models, and I've seen this actually with a lot of the farms that are involved in NOFA that I've had the opportunity to visit with the farmers or visit the farms, is, folks that are doing this are really thinking about how do we make these sorts of foods accessible to all sorts of people, both people who are able to pay more for better quality food that they know where it comes from, but then also what are other models to involve folks in those systems that maybe aren't able to pay those higher prices, but are able to participate in other ways so that they're able to access that food as well. I mean, as we talk about the price of food and where certain foods are accessible, we hear terms like, food desert is probably the most popular one, but another term you hear about is food swamp, and so areas that are full of food, but poor nutritional food choices, fast food, corner stores that don't have fresh food, and then a lot of people, particularly within the food justice and food sovereignty worlds, really talking about these issues as food apartheid issues. And so these aren't naturally occurring systems; these are human-made and human-created. And so as we think about what can we pay more for, how does that lift or how might that lift everyone up? And I think a lot of the small and family scale farmers that I've had the pleasure of working with and learning from are really leading the way on a lot of that.
Liz and Becca both used that term, food sovereignty, and I just thought people in the audience and online might like a definition of that, because I think we can deduce what it means, but hearing how you define it, I think would be really helpful, especially as it relates to some of these issues around climate change, further disadvantaging people who are already vulnerable.
I feel like you had it
Yeah, so the definition that I drew on, and there's a number of great authors. Some of the resources that we've shared as part of this talk are places to learn further about thinkers in this movement. But the concept of food sovereignty focuses on the right of people around the world to have control over how their food is produced and what kind of food sources are available to them. And I think that in the U.S., we see a lot of programs and federal policy making that really spell out and dictate, here's how we should feed people who are economically disadvantaged and unable to, their income isn't going to allow them to go buy all the foods that they would want to eat. And there's a lot of, in these sort of policies, we see all kinds of ways that decision makers are trying to stipulate, here's what you can access, here's what you should be able to spend your money on. People shouldn't be buying hot meals, or they shouldn't be buying packaged meals, and all these attitudes and values that are imposed on a group of people. And the food sovereignty movement says that we achieve more sustainable and just systems when there's that right to self-determination around food. I don't know.
Hi. I have a question about how we can be better informed about the food that is available to us in the city. I mean, sometimes it's just hard for us to get out to the farms to get the food that we know is good. So what are some resources that we can access to help us to be better consumers?
Farmers markets, are the first thing that come to mind for you all, because you can talk to all those farmers and, ask them about their practices and, even bring them things. A lot of times, a lot of people, didn't know what carbon sequestration was 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. But if you remember early on in the campaign, at least 2 of the Democratic candidates talked about carbon sequestration in their platforms, which was pretty amazing. A lot of farmers are wanting to go in that direction, and they're learning that, as a matter of fact, you get more food and it tastes better, and it costs less. You have less money tied up in fertilizer, less money tied up in irrigation. It's just a win-win for the farmer. So there are a lot of people out there learning about that, and that's one of the things that NOFA is trying very hard to teach about, and part of the reason where we're working with the state legislature on the healthy soils legislation, which is happening all over the country. But, for starters, you can go to your local farmers market. We have, in NOFA, we have an organic food guide. You go on the website, you can just look it up and see who's got what. And, some of the farms you can go out, for example, if you come to our farm, you can buy your meat for the year, or you can come out on a regular basis if you want. It's, 72 miles from Dorchester to our farm. But, there are a lot of places where you can get food and learn about your food. And I think I would start at the farmer's market and talk to the farmers. There are winter farmers markets these days too. I mean, they really are almost. I'd check around, but I know near us in Northampton, Greenfield, at least once. Yeah, at least once a month. There's if not more often.
There's a winter farmers market. Well, one other quick thing I was going to say is there are several organizations that do this, but the one that I'm most familiar with is called Red Tomato, and they actually work with small and mid-size farmers who maybe aren't cultivating enough of a crop to be able to have an inroad into kind of a bigger market to my explanation of it is basically to gather the little bits of things that people are farming so that they're able to find marketplaces for that. And so I think looking at organizations that are really trying to help solve that conundrum of the small and mid-size scale farmer that may, other than farmers markets, outlets and or selling directly to consumers, may have more of an issue finding a place in the market for their product. And so that's one example of an organization that does that. And so I think learning about the farms that they're working with, where those products are distributed, and some of those are just making the difference, or making the choice between one apple and a different apple at your grocery store, and one apple supports local farmers and the other one isn't, and so being able to make those choices as well.
Yeah, one more quick thought to add to that. I think there's also a real value in asking questions, whether you're at the grocery store or at the restaurant. And I'm thinking of, there's like the Portlandia skit, I don't know if anyone knows it, where they go and they're like, what was this chicken's name and what was his life story? But I think that there is some power in that, because once these, distribution channels, whether it's at the grocery store or restaurant, sense that consumer interest and demand, I think it really creates some upstream, awareness and willingness to disclose or talk more and think more about where groceries are sourced.
And we're just about at the end of the hour, or 2 hours. And before I turn this back over to Rebecca, I would say in particular to our students, most of us who end up in a place like this don't come from farms. We come from cities or suburbs, and our knowledge of food is largely limited to whole foods or stuff that came wrapped in plastic. And I strongly urge our students in particular to take our guests up on their invitation to join them at their farm and to get a sense of what it really means to work at a farm. And I say this because in my own experience growing up in New York, law school, and moving to Boston, becoming a lawyer, early on in my legal career, we were approached by a farming group outside of Hartford that wanted to introduce inner city kids to farm life. And they invited those of us who were young associates to go down and spend a weekend on this farm outside of Hartford to talk to kids, inner city kids, mostly kids of color. And they put a lot of pressure on me to go down to this farm for the weekend. And after a lot of resistance, I said, okay, I'll do this thing. And I don't remember exactly where outside of Hartford it was, but when I got there, they taught me to milk a cow and to do other farm activities. And when the Black and Latino kids showed up, there I was on one of those little three-legged stools, milking a cow, which was kind of a shock to most of the kids, because most in our part of the world, that is to say in New England, never imagined that an African American was a farmer. In other parts of the country, you see that, but around here, you don't. And it was kind of shocking and transformative for them, but more importantly, ultimately, it was transformative for me because I hadn't appreciated what it meant to be a farmer, and to do the work that enables all of us to go next door to Wollaston's and to grab an apple or something else, and to take for granted how things emerge from our natural environment to have the goods that keep us alive. And if you haven't spent time, even a day or two, doing real work on a farm, you just got an invitation to do that. And I would strongly encourage you, if you have an interest in food, and the systems around it, don't always think about it in the abstract. Think about it as real work that has to be done to provide the nutrition that we need. And with that, Rebecca?
Thank you so much. Connect with your food, connect with the systems, connect with the people that produce it, and connect with each other. Just a reminder that there's an opportunity after class tonight for students to do that connecting, to act on what we're learning, and to make the change. Let us end, as we always do, with just a quiet moment of reflection on what we're going to continue learning about and doing until we meet next. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to all of you. We'll see you next week.